You know, there are some people in this world that never seem to get an even break. Take, for instance, the mayor of Toronto, Bob Ford. No matter what he says or does, the press is on his case. Even his supporters can't help but shake their heads sometimes. And I don't know about you, but every photograph I've seen of him makes him look like a clown. Sometimes I can't help but feel sorry for the guy. He's such an easy target. It sort of makes you wonder if he isn't behaving that way just to get some attention. The writer of the Gospel of Mark paints Jesus' disciples in a similar light. Mark is tough on Jesus' disciples. In Mark's account of Jesus, the disciples seem doomed to always get it wrong, even when Jesus plainly lays reality in front of them. Today's reading from the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Mark is just one of the many examples of this in action. Jesus is doing his very best to prepare them for the future. He very simply tells them the mystery of their salvation, which is his mission. He will be betrayed into the hands of his enemies, who will kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again. He tells them this very openly, face to face. There can be no margin of error here for their not getting it right. Mark tells us that Jesus' disciples, in spite of this, didn't understand what he was saying. Upon reflection, I think it is hard to fault his disciples for this. The suggestion that he was going to be betrayed made them wonder if Jesus had believed one too many conspiracy theories. They knew that Jesus had enemies, but the idea that his enemies were that angry and that powerful and that well organized so that they could kill him and get away with it was stretching the point. However, the idea that he would rise again from the dead 3 days after he was killed, let alone a month later or a year later, staggered their imaginations. No, you can't really blame the disciples for not being able to comprehend what Jesus was saying. The thing, however, that makes them look like real knuckleheads is that not one of them dared to ask Jesus to explain himself. They just shut up and said nothing. Instead, Mark tells us, instead of asking him questions, they began to argue among themselves over which one of them was going to be the greatest. Now, they may have had some different reasons for doing this. Maybe they did it because they wanted to change the subject, because what Jesus had said made them feel uncomfortable, or they didn't understand. Maybe they did it because they were embarrassed, and they just didn't want to admit to Jesus that they didn't understand. And maybe they began talking about who would be the greatest because of Jesus' comment about death, and they sensed that there might be a power vacuum at the top in the near future that would need to be filled. And then again, maybe they didn't ask any questions because they were human. The truth is, us humans don't like to ask questions about things we don't understand. Those of you who are teachers know this very well. The kids in class who ask questions usually are the kids who already have an inkling of the answer, don't they? They ask questions because they want to be able to show off how smart they are. Can you remember when you were in school and you were in a class where you weren't getting it and you were afraid to ask a question of the teacher because you didn't want to be made fun of by your friends? I don't know about you, but for me, that particular subject was algebra. Algebra was like a foreign language to me. All those formulas and equations had no connection to reality for me at all. Sometimes I was afraid to ask a question because I knew I didn't even know how to properly formulate the question in terminology the teacher would understand. I didn't want to get caught in the embarrassing situation of having to help the teacher understand what I was telling her that I didn't understand. It was just too much work. One of the challenges of being a follower of Jesus is that sometimes we don't ask questions. Sometimes we don't ask important questions. Often, we don't ask hard questions. Please notice what Jesus does in response to his disciples' fear and confusion in our reading today. They don't ask the tough question of Jesus. Instead, they start arguing among themselves. And so what does Jesus do? Rather than scolding them, Jesus takes a child in his arms and declares that a child is the symbol of God's kingdom. Elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus says, "Unless you become as a child, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." In their innocence, children have the ability to ask disarmingly difficult questions. If you're a parent, or if you're around children much, you know what I'm talking about. They ask some pretty difficult questions. They ask questions like, "Why are you crying?" They ask questions like, "Why did Grandpa die?" They ask questions like, "Why can't I tell Mommy that you've let me have a second piece of apple pie?" Children are especially good at asking questions about God. Children ask some of the very same questions that well-known theologians get paid good money for spending a lifetime trying to find the answer to. Recently, one of the children in our congregation came up to me and posed such a question that I'd like to share with you this morning. That child came up to me and asked the question, "Do animals go to heaven?" Good question, huh? Do animals go to heaven? You ever thought about that? The child that was asking this question of me was around 10 years old. I don't know that I've ever had an adult ask me that question before. I don't know why. It just seems to be the way it is. Us adults shy away from those questions, don't we? We leave it to the kids to ask the difficult questions. And if we don't have the answers, then we tell them to be quiet. But they ask the hard questions. This morning, I thought it would be good, notice I didn't say fun, I thought it would be good if we talked a little bit about the hard questions that we have about God that we never ask out loud. So I want to ask you, what's one of those hard questions for God that you have? Everybody's got one, I know. What's a hard question that you... Yeah, Willie?
I've got a question. When you get cremated, and in the Bible it says the graves will open.
Okay.
Could I have it so?
Question about cremation and resurrection. Now, I should point out to you here that I'm not going to answer your questions. Okay? This sermon isn't about the answers. This sermon is about the questions. We leave the questions for another day. Okay? And the answers for another day. It's the questions I just want us to hear. Good question. Okay? Yeah, the Catholic Church put a whole bunch of scholars to work a long time back in the 60s to come up with an answer to that question. Okay. Anybody else have one of those hard questions? Yeah?
Why do we have so much when there's children in other countries that die from starvation?
Okay. Why is the wealth in this world so unfairly distributed? Why do we have so much and other people have so little? Good question. And that's a question for God, right? Okay. Somebody else, another question. Yeah, Mark.
All right, I believe this, well, we all go through pain from time to time, but some go through hellish pain. And I'd rather say, "Dear Lord," rather than say, "Make them well, please keep them well," and send cards, "I hope you're well, feeling better." We know they're not. So my prayer is, dear Lord, take their pain away, and you do what you can to help this person, right?
For sure. It's the whole question of pain.
It's pain.
It's a toughie. That's a toughie. There's been a lot of books written about that. Yeah, yeah.
My question would be, this is really stretching my way out here, but is it really, are things really going to happen the way that we read them in the Bible and the way we believe?
Okay.
But is, there's no doubt once in a while.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, some of the stuff in the Bible is a little bit hard to believe, right? Is it really going to happen that way? Good question. Yeah, Joe.
What is the salvation of those who have not had the opportunity to hear the gospel message?
Okay, another good question. What about those folks who've never heard about Jesus? What's going to happen to them? Huh? Yeah, yeah. I should be taking notes here. Fodder for sermons, huh? Okay.
It'll be on YouTube.
Yeah, right. Yeah, all I'll have to do is find it. Okay, any other questions? Yeah?
So which parts of the Bible are we to follow literally, and which parts are like parables that are...
Yeah. So, sort of like Dagmar's question, but really not. Like, what parts of the Bible do you take literally, and what parts do you take figuratively? This is what it means, but not literally. And what does it? Good question. Yeah. What do you take literally, and what figuratively? I'm going to try and do one to a person. Okay. Well, I'm sure you got a good question. You always do, but yeah.
I just wonder why it is that people have so much trouble believing in God. He's all around us. We see His creation, and yet people cannot believe. How is that?
Yeah. Why do some people have such a hard time believing in God? You run into any of those in your lifetime? Yeah. Why? Yeah. Okay. One more question, and then I need to keep moving on. Anybody else? Good questions. Okay. Did I miss something? Okay. Well, I want to tell you one of the questions I have in wrapping up. The question that I have is, why is peace on earth so hard to get? Why is peace on earth so elusive? Why do human beings end up butchering one another for causes that seem right in their own eyes, and sometimes for really no good reason at all? Why does God let us get away with such carnage? I ask that question repeatedly. As some of you may know, this past Friday was the day that was set aside by the World Council of Churches for prayer for peace around the world. And so Christians around the world were praying for peace on Friday. It's a good thing. I'm glad that the World Council of Churches did that. But, my goodness, for many centuries now, Christians and other people of goodwill have been praying for peace. It's not like we just got a bright idea and just started it. Why hasn't peace come? I mean, enough already. And yet, you and I both know that peace is not likely to break out in the next year or two. In fact, talking about reading the Bible and taking it literally, Jesus says that peace will not really come to this earth until He returns. And so my next question is, why do we have to keep waiting then? Let's do it. Let's move on. We get the point. But even as I ask that question, I know that I and we are going to have to keep waiting. Jesus tells us to be patient for the answers. He also reassures us that God loves us even though we don't have all the answers. Jesus takes us children in His arms and He says, "Of such is the kingdom of heaven. Be patient, my little ones. Have faith and believe. When the time is right, you will understand, just as my first disciples understood on that first Easter morning. And so, I want to encourage you. Go ahead. Ask God those tough questions. Don't be silent. Put those questions into your prayers and into your conversations. Share those questions with your Christian friends. Christianity is not a religion where you need to be branded as a heretic if you admit that you don't know it all. It was the Apostle John who wrote, "True love casts out all fear." So turn to God and ask away. With patience, we will all get some mind-blowing answers. Amen.